So again, welcome. Today we are covering an introduction to study rules within ARM. So we'll kind of try to go through the basics of just talking about what it is, and then some ways to build and really maximize your use of the features. Then we do have a related session next week that will kind of take this one step further. As soon as my slide moves forward here, there we go. And so really just kind of building from what we covered today, we will go through kind of all of the possibilities of the different types of rules and just go a little deeper in how you can expand. If you're familiar or you get your hands dirty a little bit with what we covered today, then be able to take that another step further is what we'll be doing next week. All right, so to get started here, I guess just laying down the real basics about study rules in case you have not encountered them before. Really, a few possibilities, a few different goals and targets that study rules can provide you. The kind of first and foremost is to be able to communicate important fields. What information is very important to this study that should be filled in. You can also define requirements, kind of tied to that idea of this information needs to be filled in. We have to have it as part of the study. You can also restrict certain information from being changed. So if certain pieces of information cannot change, they have to be this way, there's the ability to lock that information down so it isn't changed by somebody else. And finally, you can also hide confidential information as well. So a lot of times the discussion on study rules might revolve around the sponsor contractor scenario with a research study, where you have a company that is the sponsor that's planning the experiment, and then they'll have trials in different locations. They might contract that out to a different company or just a different person within that same company to actually run the trial. And so really these study rules create a way of communicating between those two sides and being able to really not just communicate, but then be able to enforce that as well and make sure that is done. Those rules, those things that the sponsor or the protocol writer cares about is followed through in the trial. And so that really is our overarching goal with study rules, and being able to make it specific to your type of research, I think is really where the power comes here. So next, I just want to go into ARM and kind of see a couple of study rules that are in place. So I've got a trial open here, and it has a couple of study rules that have been put into it. And so you can find the list of rules here. I typically use my navigation bar to select different editors. And near the bottom, we have the study rules editor. It's just like any of the others. If you're more of a menu person, under the window, there's also the study rules editor there. But it will bring up our screen here. I'm going to unpin my navigation bar so we can see this editor a little better on my screen. If you've worked with rules in the past, you might be a little surprised to see what we have here. Kind of part of our session today is to highlight the fact that we gave the study rules editor an overhaul in the most recent ARM update. So if you haven't downloaded the 2022.7, your study rules editor might look a lot more boring. It'll really just be this table here in the middle. But just now with the latest update, we've brought an interface to these rules. Hopefully it'll make it easier if you're just starting out with rules. It doesn't matter what it used to be. Hopefully this will be an easier way to view and create rules. A little easier, I think, to interact with. As I said before, it really was strictly just this big, long, kind of boring table that you'd have to talk through. But now we've got kind of an interface to it. And so really what we have is a rule. These are all the different components of the rule. It's already been configured for us, and you can see the information down below. So I've clicked into rule number 1, and we're seeing all the details either in this table below here, and on top it's also that very same information, just 2 different views of how it's been set up. And so if I were to click into row 2, you'll see up above this changes to reflect how rule number 2 has been configured, and so on and so forth. We've kind of grouped these by the different editors in ARM that you'll find the field that it actually applies to. So let's just talk about this first rule here. We can just kind of read the screen to make sense of what is it that it's doing. And so first and foremost, we have the field that has been selected. So in the general trial of our site description, it's the GPS coordinates, specifically the latitude field in this case. So we've created a rule related to this field. The type of rule, there's a few different options. Right now, this is a required rule. And so a required rule is instructions that this field needs to be filled in. So I am requiring that, in this case, the latitude of the lower left corner of my trial needs to be filled in. And the trial is not valid until that is done. Specifically, there is kind of a time frame of when I need that filled in. So down here under the condition, there is a few different options for when does this rule matter? When do I need it? And most of these, from setup, established, kind of the middle group here, is tied to the trial status of the trial. So in the site description, general trial, you have that trial status. That gives a sense of where this trial is. At established is when it's just set up throughout the season. It should be marked as interim as you're going through the season. Then as things are wrapped up and finalized, it may be changed to final. And so you kind of have that timeline of that trial schedule. And so we can tap into that for when a rule should be applied. So in our case, it was set to established. So really, as soon as the trial has been planned and established, you should know the GPS coordinates. So it would make sense in this case that we would set that to established. Maybe if we were looking at the harvest date for our crop, we wanted to require a harvest date. Well, obviously you won't know that when the trial is only established. So maybe in that case, I would choose the status equal final instead. Because once the trial is totally done, then for sure you'll know the harvest date. So you've got, those are kind of the main 2 components that you're really making that decision on when you're setting up the rule is the type. And so we talked about the required, meaning I need this field filled in. The alternative, these first 2 are kind of tied together. The other option would be to make the field or the rule just recommended. And really what that means is it's not completely necessary that we have to fill it in, but I would like to draw attention to this field that hopefully you'll fill it in. Hopefully the trialist will have it filled in, but it won't throw an error, which we'll see later on exactly the difference between those 2. But the main idea is that, does this have to get filled in? Then it would be required. If it's a little less important, but still, something that would matter or you would like to see filled in, then you can use recommended. So those are the main 2 types. We'll talk through some of the other types and the different combinations of rules in next week's session. But those are the main two, I think, in most cases that we'd use. Going down to the second rule is basically the exact same one, just with the longitude field as well. So we really did the same type of rule, just with both the longitude and latitude values. We want those GPS coordinates filled in this trial. That matters a lot to us. Moving to the third rule, we can see this is now in the assessment data editor, looking at the rating date. The main differences here, now we are using a recommended rule. So this one we're not saying is strictly necessary, but just something we would like to have. We want to point it out that you should fill that in. And then the other difference is in the condition here we have with assessment data. So this is a little different because really thinking of in the assessment section, you have different assessments as separate columns in that editor. And as the research is being done and assessments are taken, then those are slowly getting filled in. So, less harder to really tie to a specific trial status because it's really going to depend column by column where you're at, whether something should get filled in or not. So this condition is kind of self-containing within a particular column. As soon as assessment data has been filled in a particular column, then this rule will kick in. So I can go ahead and plan out my assessments. I can fill in 10, 15 assessment columns, fill in the header for what should be done, but this rule won't kick in. There would be no need to fill in a rating date until the assessment is actually performed. So not until you fill in, once data starts to get filled in a particular column, then this rule will kick in and it'll say, we recommend that you fill in the rating date with this particular assessment column now that there's data filled in. So again, you kind of have the field, the placement of the rule of where it belongs, what type, how strict are we about filling in that value, and then the timing of it. When should this kick in? I've got a slide on that. I think we've probably covered most of it, but just to reiterate, really those components of the rule. Again, you used to have to kind of cover this a little more in the slide just because we were stuck looking at that one table. I think that visualization hopefully helps a little. But the components, you've got that rule ID, really the type of rule that we're picking. Then there's the location of the field that we've chosen. How is it going to be applied? We call that condition is how that's labeled. You can also specify where the rule applies. So that last example, when we had the assessment data, you can have it applied to every column, or you could choose and you could type in, well, only these particular assessments that I've planned should have this particular rule applied. So there's a spot there on the editor to do that. Same with treatment lines. So if we were making a requirement to fill in some column in the treatment editor, you could choose specifically which lines from the treatment editor should have that rule applied to. And then finally, permissions. We didn't cover that one specifically, but that is really who can modify the rule. And that one we'll probably talk a little more on next week's session, but just real quickly to point that out, because it can be a little confusing, but you're really making note of what other licenses that may open this trial, who else should have the ability to potentially change and adjust this rule. So here, as I'm the person adding this rule, I kind of have that master permission of this is my rule I've implemented. but I can also give permissions for others to be able to change this rule if I need. Conversely, kind of on the flip side would be the fact that if I set this rule and I don't, I wouldn't want, I want to make sure the trialist follows that rule, then naturally I don't really want the trialist to just be able to delete the rule. I don't want to follow that. I'll just delete it so that way, the trial isn't marked as incomplete. Well, that would kind of defeat the purpose of the rule. So by default, you would have either everyone in my company or all the protocol owners with the permission to edit. In theory, you can set it to anyone, and that would allow any license to change the rule. It's still in place, even if I set it to anyone, and so I would still be able to see the messaging that I'm supposed to fill in the rating date, but this would allow anyone to come to this editor and just delete the rule if they wanted. So typically kind of the recommended option is everyone in my company. If we choose that, then here, if I'm the protocol writer, I'm in the sponsor company, if you will, then you're not relying on just me. If there is some situation that arises with this rule, where the trialist comes back and says something weird happened, we don't have a rating date. I don't know if it's possible in this case that wouldn't fit, but there's some issue where typically that rule works, but for some reason it doesn't. Having that ability to have anyone within the sponsor company be able to remove that rule and then send the trial back is a nice flexibility to have, but you can make it even more strict to only the protocol owners, which would be the person who set up the protocol, who kind of created the protocol and created the trial. And there's a spot in settings where you could add other licenses as protocol owners, but typically it'd just be kind of that one person who created the protocol. Usually a lot better to have a little flexibility and let people within your same company be able to edit that rule. Okay, so that's really the components of a rule. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Oh, I thought I had a slide on rule sets. I do not. Yeah, I think validation would make more sense though. So kind of the next step, and once we have some rules that we've implemented, and you can see in this trial that we did, then really the way these rules can be enforced kind of shows up in two areas. Number one, as you look at the trial, so if we go into like the site description, for example, when you are in the trial, there is a visual cue when there is a study rule that is present. So you can see here in my general trial, those two GPS fields that we have rules requiring that they're filled in, those are highlighted in this light red, or maybe it's almost pink color here. So we have a visual to say, hey, this is supposed to be filled in. The recommended rule that we had, if I go back to my assessment data section, very similar situation, just a slightly different color. So here, it's a very light blue on my screen. It's almost hard to see. Hopefully it shows up better through Zoom. But this rating date is shaded in a light blue. So that would be the color for a recommended rule. Stands out a little less, specifically because it's not required, but hopefully then is highlighted as something that matters, that we're kind of drawing some attention to that. This is supposed to be filled in on the screen. So you can see that visual as you're working on the trial. Taking that one step further, maybe we want to check our trial to make sure that we've satisfied all of the rules. Maybe I don't want to click through every single screen in the site description and all the different editors just to visually check whether anything's highlighted or not. So we call that process, we can have ARM do that for us and check this trial to see if we're missing anything. So that process is validation. And that is done through the tools editor. We can validate trial. Real quick, I have a question before I run that. Can we indicate many rating dates? I guess I don't know if I totally understand the question. Having many columns that need to have rating dates, or more of having more than one date in a particular column? Within a particular assessment, we have a spot just for one date can be selected. Excuse me. But within the rule definition, when we had that here, I go back to my study rules, we have the option here with our rating date rule to choose which ratings, which assessments do we want to recommend that a rating date is filled in. So if I wanted to narrow this down and maybe only my first 3 assessments, does this rule really apply? You can do that and limit which of those columns, which assessments should have that rule applied to. And now if we go to the assessment data, you'll see that that blue is highlighted for these first 2 and 3 are the ones I haven't satisfied yet. The column 4 does not have that rule applied. So you can choose which ones should have a rule to them. So if it depends on what type of assessment that you're doing, perhaps you want to make sure if it's a control rating and you want to make sure they fill in the pest, something like that. You want the pest filled in for that type of assessment, but for your for like a yield, you wouldn't. So yeah, you can specify those. Okay, so again, to kind of have ARM check for us on what rules we maybe have not satisfied yet, we can use the validation. So under the tools menu, down near the bottom, there's this check mark to validate trial. So it was fairly quick, but in the corner here, there's some red text to show ARM status as I kind of scrolled through the trial to find any issues that we have. And it did find one, and it's letting us know that there is a required field in the site description that is still blank, that we haven't filled in. And specifically, it's that latitude. And it'll even tell us why is it required? That's coming from study rule number 1. The nice thing is, if I click OK, ARM will actually take me right to that field. Say, this is the one that you're supposed to fill in. So, and say, oh yes, I need to fill in my GPS coordinates here. I'll pick my my office here and fill in my GPS coordinates. And you can see once those are filled in, that the highlight goes away. I have satisfied that rule. And then I would just return back to the tools menu and I can validate trial. Or there's also the keyboard shortcut of Control A, where that check mark matches up with the toolbar button at the top, check mark. Either one, all of them will do that same process. And you'll see it's going through different sections of the trial. Now it made it all the way through this time as we fixed all of the required, the required rules that typically would show up as an error. That's not valid because it's required and we didn't fill it in. That's an error. It's not a valid trial until we have filled those in. That other type of rule the recommended rule, here we can see they show up as just warnings. So it's not invalid that we haven't filled them in, but we do want to be made aware of the fact that we have not filled in the rating date in column 2 or column 3. So that is study rule number 3. Again, those are just warnings. So technically what we have right here is a valid trial because we have accomplished, we have fulfilled all of the required rules, but ARM still wants us to be aware of the types of things we might still want to consider because they're recommended rules instead. Then you'll notice this third one, kind of by chance, just the way I had done this earlier. This third one here isn't specifically a study rule that we've implemented here in this trial, but there are some internal kind of self-checks that ARM can perform. So that's kind of the second part of the trial validation. In addition to any study rules that are present, there's some just kind of logical things that ARM can check for to make sure things are filled in this case, chronologically or logically within a trial. So in this case here, it's talking about the date that I had taken this assessment versus the date that I filled it in. And I think that's probably just because I reused this trial from another example. So originally this trial was filled in, it looks like in January of 2020, and now I've repurposed it and deleted some information out. So now ARM is like, well, that can't be that you filled in the data in 2020 and yet somehow your rating date is now here in 2022. So that one's kind of just because of the way I rig up my files instead of a typical workflow there. But some other examples, maybe a more practical example of something you might see for those types of internal checking. If you have a field that has a value and a unit, and one of those two isn't filled in. So maybe I'll do that both examples here, where you have a number, but I forgot the unit, that'll also be included in the validation. So if I validate the trial once more, it's going to pop up and say, wait a minute, the sample size unit isn't filled in, even though you do have a number there. So not tied to a specific rule that we've implemented, but it's just a self-check that ARM can do to say, well, presumably, if you put in a number, you probably meant to have a unit, or conversely, maybe that number was an accident. Either way, let's draw some attention to it so it can be cleared up. So that'll take us here, and I can, again, either fill in my unit in this case, or maybe I needed to delete that value. And I don't think, yeah, that column 2 is not giving me that message just because this is in the assessment header. And if I was planning if I was planning in the protocol or before the data was taken, I may want to leave this value blank to have the trialist fill it in. So there are some specific fields where that number can be blank with a unit there. And that purpose is for, like I said, somebody planning this assessment. Let's imagine this data hasn't been taken yet. I'm just planning for this assessment to take place. I might want to give instructions to the trialist that this should be the unit I want you to use, but you depending on your trial, you might have a different sample size value, and that should get filled in. And that's actually a perfect case for a study rule. So that way you make sure that they can see that they're supposed to fill in that sample size. So another way you can add a rule, we could go to the study rules editor and create a new one like we had seen earlier, or just simply right click in that field. And the bottom of the right-click menu has a section for study rules. So if I want to make a required study rule, in our case, I want to require that that sample size value is filled in whenever the assessment data is put in. And I can select that. And here now we have that rule has been created for this column. And just to tie that in with the previous discussion, you'll be able to see now on the study rules editor, here that row number 4, we have this new rule that was just added through that right click. And that's typically the best, that's typically kind of the easiest way, I think, to for sure to get started, but maybe even when you're savvy with rules, just to go through a trial and see, yep, these fields are the ones we need. Just right click on them and add and create the rules that you want. And then you can come back here and see the summary. You can decide, in this case, since I clicked specifically in column 2, this rule was only applied to column 2. But if I wanted to and say, well, that's always going to be the case, I could clear that out. I could set my range. Maybe it should be all, all those other assessments, whatever the case may be. You can adjust the settings there after it's been added. But it's kind of nice to use that right click, because then you're in the screens that you're used to looking at. A little more visual, easier to think of. Yeah, I usually need this, I need this, and just use that right click menu to create those rules. All right, I think let's go back to our slide. That kind of covers the validation. We talked about the cross checks that are just kind of there always within that ARM validation. And then there's also the study rules, what you've defined. If you're in a particular study definition another company has, of course, they might have internal rules that they've put in that, that are just always there. But most cases, we're just talking about any study rules that have been put in there. So building off the idea here that we went through a trial and are able to kind of add and create a list of rules that we care about. We'll just say these 4 ended up being all that we needed. Most likely you can come up with more, but let's say we've made our pass through a trial and kind of found the ones that we would typically want to have. Of course, this is only in this one trial. So how do I need to do the same process for every protocol, every trial that I create? And the answer is no. Let's automate this a little bit, and we can save this list of rules for us to use in other studies. So when you have the list, the way you'd want it, the order of it doesn't matter at all, but you've got your list of rules. Then what we can do is save a set. So we're going to save this list of rules the way we've configured it into a file that'll live on my computer for me to use again and again in other studies. So if I click Save Set, it will prompt me to create a file on my computer. Much like if you've been with us for other webinars, we've done this type of process with reports and SE files and all sorts of different areas in ARM. Wanting to standardize and do something once the manual way, and then save it to a file so you can do it automatically in the future. So again, use a file name that will kind of tell you what this list of rules represents. So in my case, maybe I went through a trial and thought of the most, general rules for every study. I could imagine that maybe if I'm in a fungicide trial, I'm going to want some pest-specific information filled in. If I'm just in a variety study, that's not going to matter at all. But I'm going to be more interested in some of the crop details, whatever. You can imagine some other situations that have a different list of rules. Excuse me. But here, you really then want to name what's my goal? Why would I use this in the future? And use that as the name to kind of tell yourself and maybe others why you should use this. When I press save, we also have a chance for a file description, more characters if you want to be very verbose about the purpose of this rule set. I'm going to say it's my company's standard rules for any study that we perform. Whether you want to use this or not, it will show up when we load a set. You can see that description, but typically I think the file name usually is pretty good for that. So we have saved that set. So we've really saved this list of four rules. We've put them in a file so we can use again. So maybe I'm going to close this trial here. I won't save any of the changes we've made to it. So typically we would, but I want to start from scratch in the future. And now let's say we're working on a protocol for this next year. So I'll just quick get into a new protocol. Now we can go to our study rules editor and we can load set, or over here on the interface, we've got a rule sets tab. And this actually shows just kind of in a list form, all of the rule sets that I have saved onto my computer. So pretty much the same list. If I click load set here, you'll see that same list of files. So whichever way is easier, you do get to see the description. So if I click here, that's where that description, that longer description I typed in can be visible if you're not sure which one to pick, type of thing. But otherwise, here on the rule sets tab, I can simply click on it here and it will load that list of rules from that file into this protocol now. And so now I have that same list of things that I really care about, it's the most important things to have. Now they're here in this protocol, which then if we create each trial we create from this protocol, will all have those rules present in each trial as well. So that's really the way to package up those rules. So you can make that list once. I think best practice would be to take like last year's trial. One of the trials from last year. Think through what are the pain points. What did I have? If I'm a sponsor, what things did I have to keep going back to the trialist and say, oh, I need this filled in. I needed this, or this wasn't done right, type of thing. What are all those pain points of things that I'm constantly having to ask for? And let's instead implement that in a study rule. So that way ARM can ask for me. And I just have to tell the trialist, please validate the trial before you send it to me. So that way ARM can do that busy work for you of telling that trialist, no, you need a rating date. Oh, don't forget the GPS coordinates. That'll be done on the trialist's time, on the trialist computer within their ARM, instead of having all those emails back and forth and updating files and things like that. And I've got a great question here about these rule sets. And you're exactly right. One of the powers with the study rules is you can combine more than one together. So here I've loaded this general rules for every study. I could also load in my fungicide rule set, or here I actually have this XYZ best practices. I can turn that one on. And if I load that set, you'll see this list just gets longer. So you're able to create multiple sets, and you can load more than one into a single study. So you can see if I click into rule number 47, it looks like we're recommending that the application date get filled in. At the very top of the rules editor, it'll tell me which rule set that came in from. So I'm not quite sure, why is this one here? Oh, yes, that came in from my best practices one. But that's a great ability to have. So, depending on your research, the type of projects you work on, you can come up with a system of sets of how you might want to organize those, and you can add different ones. The nice thing with that too is they won't contradict each other. So when you load in a set, it'll compare to any existing rules. So for example, if I already had a rule that required that the application date be filled in, and then I loaded this XYZ best practices, ARM will see that, well, there's already a more strict version of this rule, so we won't have a recommended rule. It'll only be that required. So you can't get yourself into a mess by loading a bunch of rule sets. ARM will kind of take care of that for you to make sure that it's logical and you don't make something less strict by adding another set. So yeah, that appears up there at the top to see where it came from. You can always then delete after you did load this. If you're the person who loaded the set, and that kind of comes into the owner ID, which we'll dive into later. But then if I come to, we'll just pick this 13 trial state. For whatever reason, in this study, I know I don't need that. You can always delete a rule after it's been loaded into a set. So you can adjust that list if you needed to. And there, that removes it. It's not changing that rule set itself. So the next time if I use another study and I load that rule set, that rule will be there. But you can kind of customize them for this particular protocol that I'm in. I can always adjust. Great question. All right, let's go back here to our slides and make sure I haven't left out something important. So we've covered the validation process. It's important then to have that trial be validated. Whether it's that trialist working on the trial, hopefully as data is put in and that trial is worked on, using that validation is important to make sure that anything that's supposed to be filled in is filled in. If you are a sponsor and you get a trial back, that maybe should also be your first process when you receive a trial back, is to validate. And maybe to show that real quickly, the alternative here as maybe a sponsor who maybe wouldn't be the one to fill everything in, but would just like to see a list of anything that was not accomplished or filled in. There is a slightly different option still running that same validation, but we call it logging the errors. So we'll see a full list of the errors that we would get. Now, in my case, I'm in a protocol, and pretty much all of these study rules are for a trial. So that's not too surprising that we would have that. Let me close this protocol. And actually, I know I've got a trial here that will fail. So in this trial here now, if I do the validate and log the errors, instead of ARM just popping up with the first thing that it finds and taking us to that location, it instead will run through all of the routines, all of the rules and checks, and give us a list. So we have a list of errors. These are all, required fields from different study rules and things like that that have to be done in order for this to be a valid trial. And then, of course, any recommended rules show up as warnings. So if you're a sponsor, if you've received a trial back, run that validation and log errors to see, is everything that I wanted filled in actually filled in? And if not, this list you can actually save to your clipboard and you could paste it into an email or something. I'll just bring up a Word document just so you can see how it looks like. But you could then just reply back to the trialist and say, I ran the validation and I've got these errors. Please, update this trial so that way it passes validation. So it accomplishes all my rules that I filled in that I need. So that can be a nice workflow to help. And maybe that's a good encouragement time to show that trialist the validation process so they can do this check themselves. And if you are a trialist, use that validation to see if there's any rules from the sponsor. Or alternatively, if you're a trialist, but the sponsor has no study rules present, you could always create your own. So the nice thing about rules is it doesn't have to just be the sponsor, bringing in their requirements, but you could have your own list of self-checks of, hey, I want to provide the best consistent trials that I can. I'll go through and find all the things that I know I want to include, build that list, and save it as a rule set. And now I don't have to click through each and every one of my trials trying to remember all those things I care about for consistency. Instead, I can just load my rule set and hit validate. And ARM will do that work for me. ARM will catch anything that I want to be consistent that I missed in this particular study. So just depending on what side of the coin you are, rules can be really powerful either way. All right, yep, and then the last slide here, we kind of already talked about, but encouraging that throughout the season, I'm working in that trial. It's excuse me, it's important. Leverage that validation as that trial is getting filled in. It's really quick. Really, if you have all of the validation fixed, let's say yesterday I was in it, I took a couple ratings, filled it in, ran the validation, fixed whatever was wrong. Now today, when I hit validate, if I put in another assessment, if I hit validate, if everything was working yesterday, really all I'm validating is whatever little changes I've done since the last time I validated. So, a lot of times when I'm doing training, there's always, 5, 6, 10 errors there because I've rigged up a trial to show all the different combinations of issues that can arise. But more realistically, maybe there's 1, maybe there's 0. You're really only checking whatever changes have been made since the last time validation was run. So, the more often you run the validation, the smaller number of changes that you're really validating. So it's never going to be a 10-minute process to fix everything. It's going to be a quick, oh yeah, I forgot that, or no, perfect, it's valid. I didn't miss anything this time, and on you go. And it's really nice, for sharing too. If you're in that case where you just never know when your sponsor is going to shoot an email, hey, do you have an update on this trial or whatever? You'll know if last time I was in that before I saved it, I validated, then I don't have to fret. I can just drop that file in the email and send it off because I know it's valid. There's no quick, let's make sure it's up to date and scramble to get ready to share. I know that last time I was in it, the trial's valid and off it goes, no worries. Yeah, so question here about a trial. Yeah, the study rules are entirely optional. So you do not need to have any rules in a trial if you don't want. You do not need to have a rule set. If you don't want any rules, you can leave that portion of a study blank. That is totally true. So it's definitely it's an option, but not a requirement for a study. All right. Well, I think I've made it through my list. My other slides will be for the next session here. Kind of went fast and furious on the most basic types of rules. As I said, next week we'll go through all of the different options and configurations to see all the different types of rules that we have. We covered the most basic, the required and recommended. That's probably 90% of all the rules that get used are those two types. That's the most common one of, hey, I need this filled in, or hey, please, I would like you to fill it in. That's the most common rule. But there are some other functionalities and tools that can kind of be unlocked within the study rules in a study, and we'll get to see some of those next week. So got a couple minutes if anyone has questions. I appreciate the questions that we had throughout the session and your attendance as well. I know it's the holiday season here, so I appreciate those that could join. But if no other questions, I'll hang on the line for a couple minutes. If you're still typing one in or something, we can answer them. But otherwise, I don't want to hold anyone up. So anyone that does have to go, I see there is a hand raised. If you have a question or maybe just waving at us, I don't know. But hopefully you'll be able to join us next week as well as we build onto this. Or worst case, at least if you're registered, we'll be sure to send you the link if you are on holiday to be able to view that session on your own time too. But I guess thanks everybody for joining today then, and hopefully we'll be seeing you again soon.